Officer Dominic Kane thought he was having a perfect Tuesday evening when he slammed the young black man against his patrol car and handcuffed him for acting suspiciously in front of the university library. The kid kept repeating that his father would hear about this, but Dominic only laughed. Another kid with delusions of grandeur trying to intimidate him with empty threats. A short while later, Dominic's phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and terrifying in its control. "Officer Kane, this is Federal Judge Caldwell Calder. You have exactly 1 hour to release my son and present yourself in my chambers. Your career depends on how quickly you move." This is the place where stories speak louder than headlines. If you believe the truth deserves a voice, subscribe and help us keep that voice alive together. Autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves across the university campus, where the golden glow of street lamps cast long shadows between the towering oaks. The library steps were nearly empty except for a few students hurrying toward their cars with backpacks slung over their shoulders and coffee cups warming their hands against the October chill. Jordan Calder stood at the foot of the library steps, checking his phone for the third time in a few minutes. His orange university sweatshirt and worn jeans marked him as a student more concerned with his studies than with fashion. At 22, Jordan moved with the quiet confidence of someone raised to believe in justice even when the world around him suggested otherwise. I was waiting for his study partner, Sophia Reyes, who had texted that she would be late after her shift at the campus bookstore. Jordan did not mind waiting. The night was calm, and the constitutional law exam the next day demanded every minute of preparation he could gather. Professor Elias Grant had warned the class that this test would separate those who truly understood the principles of justice from those who merely memorized legal terms. The sound of tires on asphalt broke the evening stillness. A patrol car rolled slowly past the library, its spotlight sweeping over parked cars and empty benches. Jordan glanced up from his phone, noted the police car, and returned to his notes on Fourth Amendment protections. Ironic, he thought, considering what was about to happen. The patrol car made a slow turn and stopped directly in front of where Jordan stood. Officer Dominic Kane stepped out of the driver's seat with the deliberate movements of someone who had done this too many times. At 34, Dominic had 12 years on the force and a reputation among his colleagues for being thorough, though thorough usually meant something different when applied to certain demographic groups. His uniform was immaculate, his badge shone under the streetlight, and his hand rested with familiar ease on his duty belt as he approached Jordan, his gaze already loaded with assumptions about a young black man standing alone in front of a building after dark. "Good evening," Dominic said in a tone that made clear this was no friendly greeting. Jordan looked up from his phone and met Dominic's eyes calmly. "Good evening, officer. Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jordan's constitutional law training activated immediately. He knew his rights. He understood the limits of police authority and recognized that this encounter was already crossing lines that should not be crossed. "I'm waiting for a friend," Jordan answered evenly. "We're studying for an exam." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. "Studying?" "Yes." Dominic stepped closer, adopting the posture Jordan immediately recognized as an attempt at intimidation. "Do you have any identification?" "Am I being detained?" Jordan asked, keeping his voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. "I'm asking you a simple question. Do you have identification or not?" Jordan reached slowly toward his back pocket with deliberate, visible movements. He had learned from a young age that sudden motions in front of an officer could be interpreted with deadly consequences. He handed over his driver's license and watched as Dominic examined it with exaggerated thoroughness. "Jordan Calder," Dominic read aloud. "Is this address current?" "Yes, sir. I live on campus in the dorms." Dominic's expression suggested he found that information somehow suspicious. "Uh-huh. And what exactly are you studying?" "Constitutional law." A mocking smile tugged at the corner of Dominic's mouth. "Constitutional law. How convenient." He returned the license but did not step back. "So you think you know your rights?" "I know I have the right to stand on a public sidewalk without being harassed," Jordan replied, his voice still controlled but gaining firmness. The word harassed struck Dominic like a spark on gasoline. His demeanor shifted from suspicious to hostile in a single heartbeat. "You think I'm harassing you? I think you're asking questions you have no legal right to ask." and I think you know it." Dominic stepped even closer, close enough that Jordan could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. "Listen, smartass. I've got reports of suspicious activity in this area, people loitering where they don't belong. So when I see someone who matches that description, I'm going to ask questions." "And what description would that be?" Jordan asked, though both of them already knew the answer. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Around them, the campus continued its quiet nighttime routine. A couple walked past, their conversation dying as they noticed the tension between the officer and the student. They quickened their pace and looked away, the universal reaction of people who recognize danger and want no part of it. Professor Elias Grant emerged from the main library entrance with a leather briefcase in one hand and his car keys in the other. He was heading for his sedan when he noticed the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. Grant had taught constitutional law for 15 years and recognized an unlawful detention the moment he saw one. He stopped, pulled out his phone, and began recording from a distance. "Turn around," Dominic ordered suddenly. "Excuse me?" Jordan said. "Turn around. Hands on the car." Jordan's heart rate spiked, but his voice remained steady. "On what grounds? You haven't told me why I'm being detained. You haven't articulated reasonable suspicion. And you certainly haven't established probable cause for a search." Dominic's face flushed with anger. "The grounds are that I'm a police officer and I told you to do it. Now turn around before this gets worse for you." "Are you threatening me? I'm giving you a lawful order." "An order isn't lawful just because you're wearing a badge." That was the breaking point. Dominic grabbed Jordan's shoulder and spun him around with unnecessary force. "Hands on the car, now." Jordan complied, placing his palms against the cold metal of the patrol car's hood. His pre-law training screamed that this was a Fourth Amendment violation, but his father's voice echoed louder in his memory. "When you're facing injustice, document it, survive it, and fight it later in court, where justice actually lives." Dominic began patting down Jordan's pockets with aggressive thoroughness, his hands searching for anything that might justify the increasingly tense encounter. He found Jordan's wallet, his phone, and a small bottle of Tylenol. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, nothing that supported the narrative Dominic was trying to build. "What's this?" Dominic asked, holding up the Tylenol bottle as if it were evidence of international drug trafficking. "That's for headaches," Jordan answered, "which I'm definitely starting to get right now." "Don't get smart with me." "I'm not getting smart. You're arresting me for standing on a sidewalk while being black." Dominic's face darkened further. "What did you just say?" Jordan turned to face the officer, dignity intact despite the humiliation of the search. In the distance, Professor Grant kept recording, his phone capturing every moment of the encounter. "You're under arrest," Dominic declared, reaching for his handcuffs. "For what crime?" "Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice." "I haven't resisted anything. I've complied with every one of your orders, even the illegal ones." "Put your hands behind your back." Jordan looked Dominic straight in the eyes as the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around his wrists. "This is wrong, and you know it." "What I know," Dominic said, tightening the cuffs harder than necessary, "is that you people always think you're above the law." The words hung in the air like a slap. Jordan felt the familiar sting of racism dressed in the uniform of authority. He had heard variations of that his entire life, but it never stopped hurting. It never stopped being outrageous. "My father will hear about this," Jordan said quietly. Dominic laughed, a sound without a trace of humor. "Daddy? Let me guess. He's a lawyer, right? Gonna sue the department? You know how many times I've heard that threat?" "No," Jordan answered with a certainty that should have made Dominic pause. "Then what is he? A community activist? A city councilman? Some local politician who thinks he has influence?" Jordan said nothing as Dominic guided him toward the back seat of the patrol car. His silence was not surrender. It was strategy. His father had taught him that sometimes the most powerful weapon is allowing your opponent to completely underestimate you. "That's what I thought," Dominic continued, interpreting Jordan's silence as defeat. "Another kid with a big mouth and no backup. Well, here's a life lesson. Respect is earned. It isn't demanded." As Dominic pushed Jordan's head down so it would not strike the doorframe, Professor Grant stepped forward from his position near the library entrance. "Officer, I witnessed this entire encounter and I'm prepared to testify that this young man committed no crime." Dominic turned toward the voice, his hands still on Jordan's head. "Sir, I need you to step back and not interfere where you don't belong. This does concern me. I'm a professor at this university and this student was doing nothing wrong. I was acting suspiciously and became aggressive when I questioned him. I was standing on a sidewalk reading his phone. I recorded the entire encounter. He was respectful and cooperative the whole time." Dominic's jaw tightened. Another complication, but he had already made a decision, and backing down would mean admitting he was wrong. "Professor or not, you need to stay away from my investigation." "Investigation of what? What crime was committed here?" Instead of answering, Dominic shoved Jordan into the back seat of the patrol car and slammed the door. Through the window, Jordan locked eyes with Professor Grant and silently mouthed the words, "Thank you." As Dominic walked around the vehicle to the driver's side, Professor Grant called out loudly, "What is your badge number, officer?" Dominic paused with his hand on the door handle. 404. And before you start filing complaints, you might want to remember that judges don't like professors who interfere with police work. The irony of that sentence would become clear very soon. Dominic settled into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror to look at Jordan. "Comfortable back there?" Jordan held his gaze through the mirror. "Officer Kane, tonight you have made a serious mistake. The only mistake I made was not doing this sooner. You campus kids think you own this place. You think you can disrespect authority without consequences. I didn't disrespect anyone. I exercised my constitutional rights. Your constitutional rights don't mean anything when you're in my custody." As Dominic started the engine, Jordan closed his eyes and thought of his father. Federal Judge Caldwell Calder had spent 30 years on the bench, presiding over cases that had shaped civil rights law throughout the district. He had sent corrupt officers to federal prison, issued landmark rulings in police misconduct cases, and raised his son to believe that justice, though sometimes delayed, was always worth fighting for. "You know what your problem is?" Dominic continued as he pulled away from the curb. "You think because you're in college and use fancy words that makes you better than everybody else." Jordan opened his eyes and watched the campus recede through the window. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just believe I deserve to be treated with the same respect you'd give anyone else. Respect is earned, so is authority." Dominic's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Keep talking, smartass. You'll see where that gets you." The police station was a short drive from campus, and they arrived in silence. Dominic had said what he wanted to say, and Jordan was saving his words for the people who actually mattered. As they entered the station parking lot, Jordan felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Dominic still had not confiscated it, an error that would prove costly. The message was from Sophia. "Sorry, running really late. Can we reschedule the study session?" Jordan could not reply, but he could think about how different the night might have been if she had arrived on time. If Dominic had seen 2 students instead of 1. If there had been no opportunity to disguise racial profiling as police work. Yet Jordan had learned from his father that justice does not negotiate with what-ifs. Justice works with facts, evidence, and consequences. And sometimes justice wears the robe of a federal judge who will not tolerate officers who mistake his son for a threat. When Dominic opened the rear door of the patrol car, Jordan stepped out with his head high and his dignity intact. He was about to spend a night in jail for the crime of existing while black, but he knew this story was far from over. "Welcome to county accommodations," Dominic said with false hospitality. "Hope you enjoy your stay." Jordan said nothing as they walked toward the station entrance, but in his mind he was already composing the call. He would make the moment Dominic processed him into the system, the call that would change everything, the call that would remind Officer Dominic Kane that some fathers are more dangerous than others when their children are at risk. The call that would turn a routine Tuesday evening into the beginning of the end of Dominic Kane's career in law enforcement. Justice, Jordan knew, was patient, but it was also relentless, and it was about to wake up very angry. The booking process at the Riverside County Police Station followed the same gray routine Dominic Kane had performed hundreds of times. Fingerprints, photographs, personal belongings cataloged and stored. Jordan Calder remained composed through every step with the same quiet dignity he had maintained during the arrest, answering only when necessary and offering nothing more. "Empty your pockets," Dominic ordered at the processing counter. Jordan complied, placing his wallet, keys, phone, and the bottle of Tylenol on the metal counter. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Officer Harlan Briggs, barely looked up from his paperwork as he logged each item. "You get one phone call," Briggs said mechanically. "You know the procedure." Dominic picked up Jordan's phone, examining it as if it were evidence. "Nice phone for a college student. Mommy and Daddy paying for everything?" Jordan did not respond. He had learned that engaging with Dominic's provocations only fed the man's need to dominate and humiliate. Better to conserve energy for the call that actually mattered. "What's the matter?" Dominic pressed. "Cat got your tongue now that you're not standing on your precious constitutional rights?" "I'm exercising my right to remain silent," Jordan answered calmly. Dominic's face flushed. Even in custody, even after being arrested and humiliated, the kid would not break. He did not beg. He did not show the fear Dominic expected from someone in Jordan's position. It was infuriating. "Process him and put him in a holding cell," Dominic snapped. "I'll finish the paperwork." As Jordan was led toward the cells, Dominic returned to his desk in the main bullpen. The fluorescent lights of the station cast hard shadows over rows of metal desks, cluttered with coffee cups, case files, and computer terminals that had seen better decades. The night shift was quiet except for the occasional murmur of the radio and the distant sound of someone typing a report. Dominic's desk sat in the corner positioned so he could see who came and went. Personal items were sparse: a coffee mug with the department logo, a small American flag, and a framed photograph of his police academy graduation 12 years earlier. That day he had been so proud, so certain he was joining the ranks of the heroes who stood between order and chaos. The arrest report would be straightforward. Dominic had written dozens like it. Disorderly conduct, the catch-all charge that covered everything from real disturbances to situations where officers needed legal cover for questionable decisions. Resisting arrest. Even though Jordan had complied with every order, Dominic could claim that his questions and legal challenges constituted resistance. Obstruction of justice, because Jordan had questioned the legality of the detention. Dominic pulled up the standard form and began filling in the blanks. Date, time, location, suspect description. For the reason for initial contact, he wrote, "Subject observed loitering in an area with recent reports of suspicious activity." It was a lie, but a lie that would hold up in court. There had been no reports of suspicious activity. Jordan had not been loitering. But Dominic knew judges rarely questioned police testimony, especially when it involved young black men who had answered firmly during encounters for the suspect's behavior. Dominic wrote, "Subject became belligerent when questioned, used confrontational language, and refused to comply with lawful orders." Another lie. Jordan had been respectful throughout the encounter, even when Dominic's behavior had clearly crossed legal lines. But perception was everything in police work, and Dominic was skilled at constructing narratives that justified his actions. I was reaching for his coffee when his phone rang. The number on the screen was blocked, which was not unusual. Officers received calls from blocked numbers frequently: other departments, federal agencies, court officials. Dominic answered on the third ring. "Officer Kane." The voice on the other end was calm, measured, carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of commanding courtrooms and making decisions that shape lives. "Officer Kane, this is Federal Judge Caldwell Calder." Dominic's hand froze over the coffee cup. Federal judges did not call patrol officers. Not directly. Never. When federal judges needed to communicate with local police, they went through official channels: district attorneys, police chiefs, federal marshals. "I'm sorry, who did you say you were?" "I said I am Federal Judge Caldwell Calder. I believe you have my son in custody." The words hit Dominic like a physical blow. He looked around the bullpen to see if anyone was listening, but the reduced night shift staff remained focused on their own work. His mouth suddenly felt dry and the fluorescent light seemed too bright. "Your son, Jordan Calder, 22 years old, arrested approximately half an hour ago in front of the university library on what I can only assume are fabricated charges." Dominic's mind raced. This had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of joke. Federal Judge Caldwell Calder was a man who appeared in newspapers, a figure who presided over major cases that shaped constitutional law. He did not have sons who got arrested for disorderly conduct. Sir, I think there might be some confusion. There is no confusion, Officer Kane. My son was arrested tonight for the crime of standing on a sidewalk while being black. I have been a federal judge for 30 years, and I have seen this pattern more times than I care to remember. The absolute calm in the judge's voice was more terrifying than any shout. Dominic had dealt with angry parents before. Threats, demands, political pressure. But this was different. This was a voice accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that possessed the power to destroy careers with a single ruling. Judge Calder, if you are who you say you are, then you understand I was only doing my job. Your son was acting suspiciously, and when I tried to question him, he became aggressive. Stop! The single word cut Dominic's explanation like a sharpened blade. Do not compound your error by lying to me. I know my son, Officer Kane. I raised him to respect authority while demanding that authority respect him in return. I also know that Professor Elias Grant witnessed the entire encounter and recorded it on his phone. Dominic's stomach dropped. The professor. The recording. Evidence that could not be manipulated or explained away. Evidence that would show exactly what had occurred and why. Now then, Judge Calder continued with that same terrifying calm, you have exactly 1 hour to release my son and present yourself in my chambers. Your career depends on how quickly you move. The call ended. Dominic sat staring at his phone, his hand trembling slightly. Around him, the police station continued its normal operations, but everything felt different now. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the radio chatter more urgent, the very air heavier with the weight of what had just happened. He set the phone on the desk and tried to think clearly. This could still be some elaborate prank. College students were famous for their tricks, and maybe this was Jordan's way of trying to scare him into releasing him without completing the processing. But the voice on the phone had carried too much authority to be fake. The knowledge of Professor Grant's recording was too precise to be a guess. And the calm, measured tone was exactly what Dominic would expect from someone who had spent 3 decades making life-changing decisions from a federal bench. Dominic turned to his computer and opened the federal court website. A search for Judge Caldwell Calder returned immediate results. There he was, a distinguished black man in judicial robes presiding over the United States District Court for the Central District. Appointed by President Clinton in 1994, confirmed unanimously by the Senate. Known for his expertise in constitutional law and civil rights cases. Known for his zero tolerance of police misconduct. Dominic's hands trembled as he clicked through the search results. Article after article detailed Judge Calder's rulings in excessive force cases, racial profiling cases, and civil rights violations. He had sent police officers to federal prison. He had ordered entire departments to undergo civil rights training. He had written scathing opinions that had become required reading in law schools across the country. One headline made, Dominic's blood run cold. Judge Calder sentences, former detective to 15 years for civil rights violation. The article described a case from 3 years earlier, in which Judge Calder had presided over the trial of a detective who had planted evidence on black suspects. The detective had claimed he was only doing his job, that the suspects were probably guilty anyway, that planting evidence simply ensured justice was done. Judge Calder had sentenced him to the maximum penalty allowed by law, declaring in his ruling, there is no crime more corrosive to public trust than when those who swore to protect and serve instead choose to oppress and deceive. This court will show no mercy to officers who betray their oath. Dominic felt nauseous. He looked toward the cells where Jordan Calder was sitting, probably making his one phone call right now, probably speaking with his father, the federal judge, probably describing exactly what had occurred during the arrest. The report Dominic had been writing suddenly felt like a suicide note. Every lie he planned to include, every fabrication designed to justify his actions, would now be examined by one of the most powerful judges in the federal system. A judge who had built a career exposing police misconduct. A judge whose son had just become the victim of exactly the kind of behavior that sent officers to federal prison. The desk phone rang, startling him. He looked at the caller ID. It was the front desk. Kane, he answered, his voice tight. Dominic, you've got someone here who wants to see you, Torres's voice said. Says he's from the federal courthouse. He's got some papers for you. Dominic's heart rate spiked. What kind of papers? He didn't say, just asked me to call you up front. Dominic hung up and sat motionless for a moment. Papers. Not long after arresting the son of a federal judge. This could not be happening. Things like this did not happen to ordinary patrol officers. They happened to corrupt detectives, to officers with long complaint histories, to people who had crossed the line so many times they could no longer go back. But Dominic knew deep down that he had crossed a line that night. He had allowed his prejudices to dictate his actions. He had arrested someone for the crime of being black in public while refusing to submit to harassment. And now the consequences were arriving faster than he could process them. He stood on unsteady legs and walked toward the front desk. Every step felt like advancing through quicksand, every breath like inhaling concrete dust. The normal sounds of the police station, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, radio chatter, seemed muffled and distant. At the front desk, Briggs pointed to a young woman in an impeccable business suit, holding a manila envelope. She looked like a lawyer, and lawyers who appeared at police stations in the middle of the night rarely brought good news. "Officer Kane," she said, extending the envelope. "I'm Assistant United States Attorney Selena Brooks. I have a federal subpoena for you." Dominic's hands trembled as he took the envelope. Inside was a document bearing the official seal of the United States District Court. The language was formal and legal, but the message was clear. Dominic Kane was ordered to appear before Federal Judge Caldwell Calder in his chambers the following morning to provide testimony regarding the arrest of Jordan Calder. I think there must be some mistake," Dominic murmured, barely audible. "There is no mistake, Officer Kane. Judge Calder takes civil rights violations very seriously, especially when they involve members of his own family." The words struck Dominic like a physical blow. This was real. It was happening. A federal judge was using the full power of his office to investigate what Dominic had assumed would be a routine arrest that would disappear into the system like hundreds of others. "What happens if I don't appear?" Dominic asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then federal marshals will come for you," Selena Brooks answered matter-of-factly. "And you will be in contempt of court in addition to whatever civil rights charges Judge Calder decides to pursue." Civil rights charges. Felonies. Prison time. Dominic had gone from writing a routine arrest report to facing possible federal indictment in the space of a single phone call, because he had decided to harass a university student who had committed no crime other than existing while black. "Officer Kane," Selena Brooks continued, "I strongly suggest you speak with an attorney before tomorrow's hearing. Judge Calder's chambers are in the federal courthouse downtown, 10 o'clock. She turned and left, leaving Dominic standing in the lobby holding the subpoena as if it were radioactive. Briggs looked at him with curious eyes, but Dominic could find no words to explain what had just occurred. He returned to his desk as if in a dream, the subpoena growing heavier with every step. The arrest report he had been writing still sat on his computer screen, the cursor blinking after the sentence. Subject became belligerent when questioned. Dominic deleted the sentence and stared at the empty space. How do you write an honest report about an arrest that never should have happened? How do you explain that you stopped someone for no reason other than racial prejudice? How do you justify handcuffing a respectful student who was only waiting for a friend in front of a library? His phone vibrated with a text from his wife. "Working late again? Dinner's in the fridge." Dominic looked at the message and realized his wife had no idea that his entire life had just imploded. She did not know that her husband had committed the kind of error that ends careers and destroys families. She did not know that the next morning he would be standing in front of one of the most powerful judges in the federal system, trying to explain why he had arrested that judge's son without any legitimate reason. He started to type a reply, then deleted it. Started again and deleted it once more. What do you tell your wife when you have just discovered that your own prejudices have endangered your family's future? He set the phone down and looked around the bullpen. His colleagues continued their usual routines, unaware that one of them was drowning in the consequences of his own actions. In a few hours, when word of what had happened spread, Dominic would become a pariah, the officer who had drawn federal scrutiny onto the entire department, the one who had failed to distinguish between police work and racial harassment. The cell area was quiet now. Jordan Calder was probably sitting in his cell waiting for whatever came next. But unlike Dominic, Jordan had nothing to fear from the next day's hearing. Jordan had done nothing wrong. He had been the victim of precisely the kind of police misconduct Judge Calder had fought against for 3 decades. Dominic picked up his desk phone and dialed the extension for the cells. "Briggs, I need to release the kid, Calder." "Release him? I thought you were still working on the report." "Just release him. Drop the charges." "Drop them, Dominic. What the hell is going on?" Dominic closed his eyes and felt the weight of the next 12 hours pressing down on him like a mountain. "I made a mistake, Briggs. A big one." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind that ends careers." There was silence on the other end of the line. Briggs had been on the force long enough to understand that some mistakes could not be fixed with paperwork or apologies. Some mistakes followed you for the rest of your life. "I'll process the release," Briggs said quietly. Dominic hung up and deleted the arrest report from his computer. There was no point in filing charges that would be withdrawn the moment Judge Calder made a call to the district attorney. There was no point in pretending that this night had been anything other than a catastrophic error in judgment. Within a short time, Jordan Calder would walk out of the station a free man, and Dominic Kane would begin the longest night of his life, knowing that morning would bring a reckoning for which he was completely unprepared. The call had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had changed everything. Justice, Dominic was about to discover, was not only blind. Sometimes it was also the father of the young man he had decided to arrest. "You never should have been arrested. Federal Judge Caldwell." Calder stood in his study, still wearing the charcoal gray suit he had worn in court that morning, though he had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. The study occupied the entire second floor of his colonial home, its walls lined with law books, judicial opinions, and photographs that chronicled 3 decades of public service. The mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room had witnessed countless nights in which justice was researched, crafted, and pronounced with surgical precision. But this night was different. This night was personal. Jordan sat in the leather chair across from his father's desk. He no longer wore the orange sweatshirt that had somehow marked him as suspicious in Officer Kane's eyes. He had changed into a simple white t-shirt and jeans, but the dignity that had accompanied him throughout the arrest remained intact. His hands were steady as he recounted the events of the evening, his voice calm, yet undergirded by the controlled anger of someone who had just experienced the reality that constitutional law textbooks could only describe in theory. "He said, 'You people,'" Jordan repeated, looking his father in the eyes. "Not once, but twice, as if my race was all he needed to know about my character." Judge Calder listened without interrupting, his face a mask of judicial restraint that concealed the fury growing beneath. He had raised Jordan to be proud, to be respectful, to believe in the system, even when the system failed people who looked like them. And now that same system had failed his son in the most predictable and outrageous way possible. "Tell me about the professor," Judge Calder said in the same measured tone that had commanded courtrooms for 30 years. "Professor Grant teaches my constitutional law class. He saw everything and recorded it on his phone." Jordan leaned forward slightly. "Dad, he's a good man. He tried to intervene. He told Officer Kane I hadn't done anything wrong. And Kane's response was to tell Professor Grant to stay out of other people's business and get away from his investigation." Jordan's mouth twisted with bitter irony. "The investigation of me standing on a sidewalk." Judge Calder turned toward the window overlooking his neighborhood. The houses were dark except for a few porch lights and the occasional glow of televisions. Ordinary families living ordinary lives, unaware that in this house a federal judge was methodically planning the legal destruction of a police officer who had committed the catastrophic error of racially profiling his son. Caldwell Calder had not always been a federal judge. He had grown up in the same kind of neighborhood where Jordan had been arrested that night. Places where black men learned early that their mere presence could be interpreted as a threat regardless of their education, their clothing, or their intentions. He himself had been stopped by officers who saw his skin color before his law degree. He had been questioned, searched, and humiliated by men who used their badges as shields against accountability. But Caldwell Calder had also spent 3 decades fighting that system from within, using the law that so often failed people like him. He had presided over more than 200 police misconduct cases. He had sent corrupt officers to federal prison. He had written judicial opinions cited in law schools and filed in Supreme Court briefs. And he had done it all with the measured, methodical approach that had made him one of the most respected judges in the federal system. Tonight all that experience and authority would be focused on Officer Dominic Kane. "Jordan," Judge Calder said, turning to look at his son, "I want you to write down everything you remember from tonight. Every word Kane said, every action he took, every moment of the encounter. Leave nothing out, no matter how small it seems." Jordan nodded and took the legal pad his father handed him. "Are you going to file a complaint with Internal Affairs?" Judge Calder's smile was cold and precise. "Internal Affairs is for minor infractions and policy violations. What Officer Kane did tonight was a federal crime." The words hung between them. Jordan knew enough law to understand what his father meant. Civil rights violations under federal statute, 18 U.S.C. Sever 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. The same statute that had been used to prosecute police officers in high-profile cases across the country. The same statute that carried a maximum penalty of life imprisonment when the violation involved the use or attempted use of a dangerous weapon. Kane had used handcuffs. He had used force. He had used his authority as an officer to violate Jordan's constitutional rights based solely on race. Under federal law, that made him a criminal. "Dad," Jordan said quietly, "I don't want this to become some huge federal case. I just want people to know what really happened." Judge Calder sat behind his desk and studied his son's face. After 30 years on the bench, he could read people the way others read law books. Jordan was not asking for leniency for Officer Kane. He was asking for proportion. He was asking for justice, not vengeance. "Son, what happened to you tonight happens to young black men in this country every single day. Most of them don't have fathers who are federal judges. Most of them don't have constitutional law professors recording their arrests. Most of them go through the system and are forgotten." Judge Calder leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of accumulated frustration. "Officer Kane chose you as a victim because he believed you were powerless. He was wrong." On the judge's computer, the federal court's case management system was open, and he began typing with the practiced efficiency of someone who had drafted thousands of judicial orders. But this was no routine order. This was the beginning of a comprehensive federal investigation into the pattern and practice of civil rights violations by Officer Dominic Kane. The first document he drafted was a formal request to the United States Attorney's Office for a civil rights investigation. The second was a subpoena for Kane's personnel file, training records, and complaint history. The third was an order preserving Professor Grant's recording as evidence. Judge Calder was only getting started. He opened a new browser window and accessed the federal court's database of prior civil rights cases. A search for Kane Dominic returned no results. The officer had never been sued in federal court. But that did not mean he had never violated anyone's civil rights. It only meant his previous victims had lacked the resources or connections to pursue federal charges. Judge Calder picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It was answered on the first ring. "Assistant United States Attorney Brooks." "Selena, this is Caldwell Calder. I know it's late, but I have a federal civil rights case that requires immediate attention." Assistant U.S. Attorney. Selena Brooks had worked with Judge Calder on dozens of cases over the past 5 years. She was one of the most competent prosecutors in the district, with a particular specialization in police misconduct cases. More importantly, she was someone Judge Calder trusted to handle a matter with the seriousness it deserved. "What's the situation, Judge?" "A Riverside police officer arrested my son tonight for the crime of standing on a sidewalk while being black. The officer's name is Dominic Kane, badge number 404. The arrest was witnessed and recorded by a university professor." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Selena Brooks immediately understood this was no ordinary civil rights case. This was a federal judge's son, victimized by exactly the kind of police misconduct Judge Calder had fought his entire career. "What do you need from me?" "Personnel records, complaint history, training files, body camera footage if it exists. I want to know every stop Kane has made in the last 5 years, every arrest, every use of force report, and I want it by morning." "Judge, you know I'll do everything I can, but some of that information may take—" "Selena." Judge Calder interrupted with the same authority that had silenced countless attorneys over the years. My son was arrested for walking while black by an officer who called him "you people" and told him his constitutional rights meant nothing. This is not a favor. This is a federal judge formally notifying the United States Attorney's Office that a police officer has committed a federal crime under color of law. Understood. You'll have everything you need by morning. After hanging up, Judge Calder returned his attention to the computer screen and began investigating Officer Kane's background using public databases. What he found did not surprise him, but it was useful. Dominic Kane had been hired by the Riverside Police Department 12 years earlier. His training records showed completion of basic academy requirements, but no advanced training in civil rights or cultural sensitivity. His social media profiles, which Kane had carelessly left public, revealed a pattern of posts ranging from questionable to openly racist. Judge Calder took screenshot after screenshot of Kane's Facebook posts, comments about thugs and criminals that clearly used coded language for black men, shared articles from sites promoting racial stereotypes, jokes that depended on racist humor. A mental pattern that explained exactly why Kane had looked at Jordan and seen a threat instead of a university student. But social media posts were not criminal evidence. They were character evidence useful for establishing Kane's mindset and motivations. The real evidence would come from Kane's arrest history and the complaints against him. Judge Calder opened a new document and began drafting an extensive legal memorandum detailing the federal case against Officer Kane. The charges would include deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to violate civil rights if other officers had participated in covering up Kane's misconduct. As he wrote, Judge Calder's mind returned to a conversation he had had with Jordan 3 years earlier when Jordan was choosing his college major. Jordan had asked whether he should study law, whether he should follow his father's path toward the federal bench. "The law is a tool," Judge Calder had told his son. "In the right hands it can build justice. In the wrong hands it can perpetuate oppression. The question is not whether you should study law. The question is what you want to build." Tonight Judge Calder was building something very concrete: the complete and total destruction of Dominic Kane's career in law enforcement. The legal memorandum grew to 15 pages as Judge Calder methodically detailed every element of the federal crimes Kane had committed: unlawful detention, racially motivated interrogation, false arrest, excessive force during handcuffing, verbal abuse, and racial intimidation. Each action was a separate federal offense. Each offense carried possible prison time, and all of it had been committed against the son of a federal judge who had spent 30 years studying precisely this kind of case. Judge Calder's phone vibrated with a text from Jordan. "Dad, I'm going to sleep. Thank you for everything tonight." Judge Calder looked up from the computer screen and realized it was well past midnight. Jordan had gone to bed hours earlier, but the judge had been so absorbed in building the federal case against Kane that he had lost track of time. He walked to the window and looked out over the sleeping neighborhood. In a few hours the sun would rise on what would be the worst day of Dominic Kane's life. Kane would wake up thinking he had survived the encounter with Jordan Calder, that releasing him and dropping the charges had solved the problem. Kane had no idea that federal justice moved slowly but inevitably, like a glacier that ground everything in its path to dust. Judge Calder returned to his desk and opened his calendar. The next day's schedule was filled with routine hearings and case management conferences, but he cleared his mid-morning slot and wrote a new entry: Kane, initial conference. Then he took his phone and texted his courtroom deputy. "Cancel my 10 o'clock hearing tomorrow. Emergency federal civil rights matter requires immediate attention." The reply came within minutes. "Understood. Courtroom prepared for emergency hearing." Judge Calder's staff knew better than to ask questions when he declared a civil rights emergency. They had worked with him long enough to understand that when Judge Calder focused his attention on police misconduct, careers ended and justice was served with mathematical precision. As he finally prepared to go to sleep, Judge Calder thought of the hundreds of young black men who had been victimized by officers like Kane, the ones who did not have federal judge fathers, the ones whose arrests were never recorded by constitutional law professors, the ones who were processed through the system and forgotten. Officer Kane had chosen the wrong victim. But more importantly, he had committed his crime in front of the wrong judge. The next morning, Dominic Kane would learn that some fathers are more dangerous than others when their children are threatened. And Federal Judge Caldwell Calder would remind the Riverside Police Department why civil rights laws exist, and what happens to officers who believe they can violate them without consequences. Judge Calder had learned over 30 years on the bench that justice was not only blind. Sometimes justice was a father whose son had been wronged, and sometimes that father had the power to set everything right. The fluorescent lights of the Riverside Police Station seemed harsher at midnight, casting everything in unforgiving relief as Officer Harlan Briggs walked toward the cells with a keyring that jingled like tiny bells in the unnervingly quiet corridor. His footsteps echoed against the concrete walls, each one announcing the arrival of news that would change everything for the young man sitting in cell number 3. Jordan Calder sat on the metal bench, his back straight against the cold wall, reading a constitutional law textbook that Briggs had allowed him to keep from his belongings. Even in jail, even after being arrested for the crime of existing while black, Jordan was still studying for the exam the next day. The irony was not lost on him. He was memorizing Fourth Amendment protections while locked up precisely because of their violation. "Calder," Briggs called as he approached the cell. "You're being released." Jordan looked up from the book, his expression carefully neutral. "Released? What about the charges?" Briggs unlocked the cell and pushed the door open with a weary turn of the key. "Kane says it was a misunderstanding." Jordan closed the book and stood slowly. After a lifetime as a black man in America, he had learned to distrust sudden reversals offered by police. Misunderstandings did not usually resolve that quickly, and charges did not disappear without reason. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Jordan asked as he followed Briggs toward the processing desk. Briggs shrugged, but his body language suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Above my pay grade, kid. I just processed the paperwork." As they walked through the main area of the station, Jordan could feel the eyes on him. Night shift officers looked up from their computers and reports, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been concern. Word that something unusual was happening with the young Calder arrest had already spread through the station. Officers who had seen routine stops turn into federal investigations knew the signs, and all of them were present that night. At the processing desk, Briggs handed Jordan a manila envelope containing his personal belongings. "Phone, wallet, keys, and your Tylenol," Briggs said in a tone that might almost have been an apology. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Jordan stored his belongings and looked around the station. Officer Kane was nowhere to be seen, which probably meant he was hiding in his cubicle trying to figure out how to explain what had happened to his superiors. That absence said more about Kane's mental state than any report could. "Can I ask you something, Officer Briggs?" Jordan said as he signed the release forms. "Depends on what you're going to ask. In your experience, how often do officers drop charges this quickly after an arrest?" Briggs froze. The pen stopped halfway to the paper. He had been a cop long enough to recognize a trap question when he heard one, but he had also been a cop long enough to know when one of his colleagues had made a serious mistake. "Not very often," Briggs admitted. "Usually means something went wrong with the arrest. Something like violating someone's civil rights." Briggs held Jordan's gaze and saw intelligence, education, and that quiet confidence that comes from knowing your rights and having the resources to enforce them. This was not a scared kid who could be intimidated into silence. This was someone who understood the system and knew how to use it. "Like I said, above my pay grade." Jordan finished signing the release forms and headed toward the station exit. As he passed the bullpen area, he could see Officer Kane hunched over his desk, staring at the computer screen with the empty expression of someone whose world had just collapsed. Kane looked up just as Jordan passed, their eyes meeting for an instant across the fluorescent-lit room. In that moment, both men understood that this was far from over. Kane's expression was a mixture of fear and defiance, the look of someone who had been caught but was not ready to admit defeat. Jordan's expression was calm and determined, the look of someone who had been wronged and intended to see justice done. Outside, the October air felt clean and cool compared with the stale atmosphere inside. Jordan pulled out his phone and saw 17 missed calls from his father, along with messages from friends who had already learned of his arrest through the campus grapevine that spread news faster than social media. I was reviewing the messages when a familiar voice called his name from across the parking lot. "Jordan, thank God you're all right. Professor Elias Grant hurried toward him, his normally impeccable appearance disordered by hours of worry. His gray hair was disheveled and his tie loose, but his eyes were alert and full of concern. "Professor Grant, what are you doing here? I've been waiting 3 hours to make sure you got out safely. I also wanted to give you this." Grant held up his phone. "I recorded the entire encounter. Every word, every action. It's all here." Jordan felt a wave of gratitude toward the man who had chosen to involve himself in a situation he could easily have ignored. "You didn't have to do that. You could have just left." "No, I couldn't," Grant answered firmly. "I've taught constitutional law for 15 years, and I've never seen a clearer violation of Fourth Amendment protections. What that officer did to you was a textbook case of racial profiling and unlawful detention." They walked toward Grant's sedan as the professor continued. "I've already contacted the university's legal department and the local ACLU chapter. I also sent copies of the recording to the district attorney's office and the FBI Civil Rights Division." Jordan stopped walking. "The FBI? Jordan, what happened tonight wasn't just a bad arrest. It was a federal crime. Deprivation of rights under color of law is a serious charge, and that recording is evidence that could put Officer Kane in federal prison." As they reached Grant's car, Jordan thought about his father's words hours earlier. Judge Calder had said that most victims of police misconduct did not have constitutional law professors recording their arrests. Jordan was beginning to understand how fortunate he had been that Professor Grant walked out of the library at exactly the right moment. "Can I ask you something, Professor?" "Of course. In your opinion, based on what you saw tonight, did Officer Kane have any legal justification for stopping me?" Grant's expression hardened. "Absolutely none. You were standing on a public sidewalk, not bothering anyone, clearly waiting for someone. There was no reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, no probable cause for a search, and certainly no justification for an arrest. And the things he said to me, the comments about you people and that my constitutional rights meant nothing?" Grant shook his head. "That's evidence of racial animus and deliberate indifference to your civil rights. Combined with the unlawful arrest, it turns this into an airtight federal case." Jordan's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. The caller ID showed his father's number. "Dad? Jordan, are you out?" "Yes, they released me about 10 minutes ago. Professor Grant is here with me." "Good. I need both of you to come to the house immediately. There are things we need to discuss." 20 minutes later, Jordan and Professor Grant were seated in Judge Calder's study, the same room where the federal case against Officer Kane had been meticulously planned only hours earlier. Judge Calder had changed into casual clothes, but his demeanor remained that of a calm, authoritative magistrate completely focused on the matter at hand. "Professor Grant," Judge Calder said, "I want to thank you for your intervention tonight and for preserving evidence of Officer Kane's misconduct." Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Judge Calder, I have to admit I had no idea Jordan was your son when I decided to record the encounter. I simply saw a clear civil rights violation unfolding in front of me. That makes your testimony even more credible. You acted on principle, not personal connection." Judge Calder turned to his computer and opened a new document. "I need you to provide a sworn statement describing everything you saw tonight, every detail, no matter how small." As Grant began recounting the events, Jordan listened with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because people like Professor Grant existed and were willing to involve themselves to protect a stranger's rights. Sadness because that protection was necessary at all. "The most disturbing part," Grant continued, "was Kane's absolute dismissal of Jordan's constitutional knowledge. When Jordan mentioned his rights, Kane became more aggressive, as if education and legal understanding were somehow a threat to his authority." Judge Calder nodded. "That's a common pattern in civil rights cases. Officers who engage in racial profiling often react with hostility when their victims demonstrate knowledge of the law." Jordan's phone vibrated with a text from his study partner, Sophia. "I heard what happened. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The message reminded Jordan that his arrest had occurred in an era of social media in which news traveled instantaneously. By morning, everyone on campus would know that an officer had arrested a black student for standing outside the library. The story would spread, generating conversations and debates about racial profiling and police accountability. But most people would not know the rest of the story. They would not know that the arrested student was the son of a federal judge. They would not know that Officer Kane had unwittingly triggered a federal investigation that would expose his pattern of racist conduct. They would not know that justice was about to arrive with the full force of the federal government behind it. Judge Calder stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, Dominic Kane was probably preparing to go to work, unaware that his 12-year pattern of misconduct was being exposed with mathematical precision. Somewhere out there, young black men were going about their daily lives, unaware that they were potential targets for an officer who saw their race as sufficient justification for harassment. "Selena," Judge Calder said into the phone, "I want you to contact every complainant in Kane's file, every single one. I want sworn statements. I want documentation. And I want them to know that this time their complaints are being taken seriously. Some may be afraid to come forward. Previous complaints were buried or dismissed. So we will make it clear that this is different. This is a federal investigation with the full authority of the United States District Court behind it. Anyone who has been a victim of Officer Kane deserves to have their voice heard." When Brooks gathered the files and prepared to leave, Judge Calder turned from the window with an expression that carried the weight of 30 years of accumulated determination. "Tell the U.S. Attorney that this is not about one bad arrest. This is about a pattern of systematic civil rights violations that has been ignored for far too long. Tell him we are going to expose every instance of misconduct, every covered-up complaint, every occasion on which the system failed to protect citizens from an officer who never should have worn a badge." After Brooks left, Judge Calder returned to his desk and powered on his computer. The federal court's case management system displayed his calendar for the day: routine hearings, follow-up conferences, and the mid-morning slot that would change Dominic Kane's life forever. Before that, Judge Calder had more research to conduct. He accessed the National Crime Information Center database and searched Kane's name in the system. What he found was revealing. Kane had applied for positions at 3 other police departments before being hired by Riverside. 2 of those departments had rejected his application after the psychological evaluation. The 3rd had offered him a position, but Kane had withdrawn his application for unknown reasons. Judge Calder opened the psychological evaluation reports from Kane's hiring process. The department psychologist had noted concerning attitudes toward authority and possible conflicts with minority populations, yet still recommended hiring him with the requirement that he complete additional cultural sensitivity training. According to Kane's personnel file, that training had never been completed. Judge Calder's phone rang, interrupting his review of the documents. "Chambers of Judge Calder." "Judge, this is Captain Amara Chen of the Riverside Police Department. I understand you have requested Officer Kane's presence in your chambers this morning." Captain Chen's voice carried the careful tone of someone who knows she is walking through a minefield. She had been a police administrator long enough to recognize when one of her officers had provoked a federal incident and was calling to assess the damage. "Captain Chen, that is correct. Officer Kane arrested my son last night for standing on a sidewalk while being black. I am conducting a preliminary investigation into possible civil rights violations." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Judge, I want you to know that we take all complaints very seriously, and if Officer Kane acted inappropriately—" "Captain," Judge Calder interrupted, "this is not a complaint. This is a federal investigation. I have evidence of a 12-year pattern of civil rights violations by Officer Kane, and I intend to pursue federal charges." Another longer pause. "What can I do to help resolve this situation?" "You can ensure that Officer Kane appears in my chambers at 10 o'clock as ordered. You can also begin preparing for a comprehensive review of your department's policies on racial profiling and civil rights training." "Judge, I hope we can handle this matter internally." "Captain, internal handling is what allowed Officer Kane to accumulate 43 civilian complaints over 12 years with virtually no consequences. Internal handling is the reason my son was arrested last night for exercising his constitutional rights. This matter is now in federal hands." Judge Calder hung up and returned to his research. The pattern grew clearer with every document he reviewed. Kane was not merely a bad cop. He was a dangerous cop whose misconduct had been systematically covered up by a department more interested in protecting its image than in protecting citizens' rights. At 9:45, the judge's courtroom deputy knocked on the chamber door. Judge, Officer Kane is here for his 10 o'clock appointment. He's in the hallway with what appears to be a lawyer. Judge Calder closed the files he had been reviewing and adjusted his judicial robes. The confrontation for which he had prepared all night was about to begin. Show them in. Dominic Kane entered Judge Calder's chambers looking like a man who had aged a decade in a single night. His normally immaculate uniform was wrinkled. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his hands trembled slightly as he approached the judge's desk. Beside him walked a nervous man in a poorly fitting suit who introduced himself as Kane's union representative. Officer Kane, Judge Calder said, his voice carrying the full authority of the federal bench. Take a seat. Kane sank into the chair, avoiding the eyes of the judge whose son he had arrested 12 hours earlier. The weight of his error settled on his shoulders like a mountain, and he could feel his career crumbling beneath him with every second that passed. Officer Kane, before we begin, I want to make something clear. This is not an internal affairs hearing. This is not a departmental disciplinary proceeding. This is a federal investigation into possible civil rights violations. Do you understand the difference? Kane's voice came out as a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. Good. Because what happens in the next few minutes will determine whether you face federal charges that could send you to prison for the rest of your life. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kane's union representative shifted uneasily in his chair, clearly out of his element in a federal setting. Judge Calder opened the first folder and began the systematic destruction of Dominic Kane's career. In 12 years with the Riverside Police Department, you have generated 43 civilian complaints. Can you explain this pattern? The investigation had begun in earnest, and Dominic Kane was about to discover that some judges do not merely wear robes. Sometimes they also carry the righteous anger of a father whose son has been wronged. At 7:15, the emergency meeting in the Riverside Police Department conference room had the atmosphere of a war council facing imminent defeat. Police Chief Harlan Graves sat at the head of the scarred wooden table, his usually imposing presence diminished by the weight of the crisis that had erupted overnight. Around him sat the department's senior command, Captain Amara Chen, Internal Affairs Director Raymond Briggs, Lieutenant Selena Chun, and Detective Garrett Holt, one of the few officers who had consistently filed complaints about Dominic Kane's conduct. The fluorescent ceiling lights hummed, casting hard shadows across faces marked by concern, fear, and silent calculation. On the table rested a stack of federal subpoenas delivered by U.S. Marshals at dawn, along with printed copies of the 43 civilian complaints against Officer Kane that Internal Affairs had deemed inconclusive or unfounded over the past 12 years. Chief Graves, a 30-year veteran who had risen through the ranks in an era when police accountability was more theory than practice, looked older than his 58 years as he addressed the group. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a federal situation. Judge Caldwell Calder is investigating Officer Kane for civil rights violations stemming from last night's arrest of his son. The FBI Civil Rights Division is involved. The U.S. Attorney's Office is involved. And every decision we make from this point forward will be scrutinized by federal authorities. Captain Chen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had tried to reform the department's practices for the past 3 years, but had met resistance from the old guard who viewed accountability measures as attacks on police authority. Now the very misconduct she had tried to prevent threatened to destroy careers and bring federal oversight to the entire department. Chief, Chen said, I've been warning about Kane's pattern for months. His complaint history is indefensible, and we should have acted sooner. Internal Affairs Director Briggs, a heavy-set man who had built a career protecting officers from the consequences of their actions, frowned at the implied criticism. Those complaints were thoroughly investigated. Most came from known troublemakers or people with anti-police agendas. Kane was following department protocols. Detective Holt, who had witnessed Kane's racist behavior firsthand during joint operations, could not remain silent. Protocols, Raymond? I've seen Kane's protocols. He stops black men for the simple act of breathing while black and then escalates every encounter until he fabricates a justification to arrest them. Enough, Chief Graves said, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew Holt was right. He knew Kane's misconduct had been an open secret among officers who were either too afraid or too implicated to report it through proper channels. Lieutenant Chun, the department's youngest supervisor and a constitutional law specialist, opened her laptop and projected Kane's complaint history onto the conference room screen. The data was devastating when presented visually. A clear pattern of racial targeting, excessive force, and rights violations that had been systematically ignored by the very people charged with preventing such abuses. "Chief, this is not about one bad arrest," Chun said, her voice firm but urgent. "This is an institutional failure. Kane's pattern was visible to anyone who took the time to analyze the data objectively. The numbers on the screen told a story none of them could deny. 43 complaints in 12 years. 39 of those complaints involved black men between 18 and 35. 0 complaints had resulted in serious disciplinary action. The department had received federal funding for community policing programs and civil rights training, yet Kane had never attended any of the mandatory sessions. Briggs attempted to defend the indefensible. Judge Calder is emotionally compromised because they arrested his son. He's using his federal position to carry out a personal vendetta against an officer who was only doing his job. The silence that followed Briggs's statement was heavy with disbelief. Even the officers who normally defended their colleagues recognized the absurdity of claiming that arresting a federal judge's son for standing on a sidewalk constituted legitimate police work. Holt leaned forward, his expression grave. "Raymond, I was there last month when Kane stopped 3 black teenagers for looking suspicious outside the movie theater. They were waiting for their parents to pick them up after a film. Kane had them on the ground in handcuffs before backup even arrived." "Did you file a report on that incident?" Chief Graves asked. Holt's jaw tightened. "I tried. Briggs told me it wasn't my concern and that Kane was handling the situation correctly." All eyes turned to Briggs, whose face had gone pale as the institutional cover-up began to unravel in real time. The pattern was not merely Kane's individual misconduct. It was a systematic failure of supervision that had allowed and protected racist policing for more than a decade. Captain Chen pulled out her phone and began reading a message she had received minutes earlier. "Not necessarily, Raymond. Recorded evidence may be inadmissible in a criminal trial, but it is fully valid in an administrative or federal investigation. And if Hamilton tried to report this and you ignored her, then we don't just have Kane as a problem, we have a cover-up." The word cover-up landed on the room like a bomb. No one spoke for several seconds. Captain Chen reviewed another file on her phone. "Besides, Hamilton isn't the only one. There are 2 patrol officers who filed verbal complaints about Kane last year. Neither was documented." Graves sank back in his chair. The institutional collapse was happening in real time and there was no way to stop it. "What else?" he asked, his voice without force. Lieutenant Chun answered without looking up from her laptop. "The FBI has requested access to every internal email mentioning Kane since 2015. They're also reviewing the data analysis software for racial patterns and stops." Chin added, "The U.S. Attorney is requesting radio recordings, patrol GPS data, body camera footage, and any additional evidence of unreported use of force." The room fell silent. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Finally Graves spoke, his voice tired and defeated. "They're going to put us under federal supervision." Shun answered softly, "Yes, and we deserve it." A few miles away in Judge Calder's chambers, the crisis was reaching its peak. The judge's assistant knocked gently on the door. "Judge, Officer Kane and his attorney are ready." Judge Calder nodded, calmly closed the last file, and straightened his judicial robes. His face was calm, but implacable. At that moment, Dominic Kane was walking into a process he did not understand and from which he would not emerge intact. But in the Riverside Police Department conference room, the true magnitude of the disaster was only beginning to reveal itself. "Raymond, this is not about admissibility in a criminal trial. This is about a federal civil rights investigation where different rules apply. And more importantly, this is about the fact that a young officer felt she had to secretly document her partner's racism because the official complaint process was worthless." The truth of Holt's statement was undeniable. Officer Lila Hamilton's secret documentation existed because the department's official oversight mechanisms had failed completely. Her evidence would demonstrate not only Kane's individual misconduct, but the institutional dysfunction that had made that documentation necessary. Chief Graves's phone vibrated with a message from the mayor. "Emergency meeting at City Hall in 1 hour. Bring everything." Graves looked around the conference room at his command staff and realized that the department he had led for 8 years was about to be transformed completely. Federal supervision, consent decrees, and court-ordered reforms would reshape everything from hiring practices to use-of-force policies. "This is what's going to happen," Graves said, his voice carrying the resignation of someone accepting inevitable consequences. "We are going to cooperate fully with the federal investigators. We are going to provide every document they request. And we are going to begin immediate reforms to ensure this never happens again." Briggs made one last attempt to protect the status quo. "Chief, if we admit Kane's arrests were problematic, we expose ourselves to hundreds of lawsuits." "Raymond," Graves interrupted, "we are already facing hundreds of lawsuits. The question is whether we want to be seen as a department that allowed misconduct or as a department that took responsibility for correcting it." Captain Chen seized the opportunity to push the reforms she had been advocating for years. "Chief, I recommend we immediately implement body cameras for all officers, mandatory de-escalation training, and an independent civilian oversight board with real investigative authority." Graves nodded. "Draft the proposals. We'll present them to the City Council next week." Detective Holt raised his hand. "What about the officers who tried to report Kane's misconduct through proper channels? Are we going to protect them from retaliation?" The question highlighted another aspect of the institutional failure. Officers who had tried to report misconduct had been ignored, silenced, or punished for their efforts to maintain professional standards. "Garrett, I want you to compile a list of every officer who filed complaints about Kane or reported concerns through any channel. They will be protected witnesses in the federal investigation, and they will be recognized for their integrity." As the meeting continued, the scope of the necessary reforms became clear. The department would need new leadership in internal affairs, comprehensive retraining for all officers, revised policies on stops and arrests, and a complete cultural transformation that prioritized constitutional rights over corporate protection. Lieutenant Chun checked Kane's current status on her laptop. "Chief, Kane is supposed to be in Judge Calder's chambers right now for questioning. His union representative called half an hour ago requesting legal support from the department." Graves shook his head. "Kane is on his own. The department cannot provide legal assistance to officers facing federal civil rights charges." The reality was beginning to settle for everyone in the room. Dominic Kane's career was over. His crimes would be prosecuted with the full weight of federal law, and the department that had protected him would face years of supervision and reform. But perhaps most importantly, Kane's victims would finally have the opportunity to be heard and see their rights vindicated. When the meeting ended, Detective Holt approached Captain Chen privately. "Captain, there's something else. I've been keeping my own records of problematic incidents involving several officers. Kane wasn't the only one with questionable practices." Chen looked at Holt with a mixture of gratitude and dread. "How many officers are we talking about?" Holt's expression was grim. "At least 6 that I can document. This goes way beyond Kane." Captain Chen understood that the federal investigation triggered by Jordan Calder's arrest was about to expose a culture of misconduct that extended far beyond a single racist officer. The reckoning that was coming would transform not only individual careers, but the very nature of policing in their community. In Judge Calder's chambers, Dominic Kane was about to face the consequences of 12 years of racist policing. But in the Riverside Police Department conference room, an entire institution was beginning to confront the reality that protecting bad officers had finally led to federal intervention that would change everything forever. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Federal Judge Caldwell Calder's chambers had been transformed into a command center for what was becoming one of the most comprehensive police misconduct investigations in the district's history. The mahogany conference table was covered with evidence files, witness statements, digital recordings, and medical records that painted a devastating portrait of Dominic Kane's 12 years of terror against the black community. Assistant United States Attorney Selena Brooks sat across from Judge Calder, surrounded by boxes of evidence that federal agents had been collecting since dawn. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Torres, a civil rights specialist, had joined them with laptops displaying digital evidence that would form the backbone of the federal case against Kane. "Judge Calder," Agent Torres said as she opened her laptop to display a series of body camera recordings, "we have recovered footage from 6 separate incidents involving Officer Kane over the past 18 months. None of these recordings were included in his reports or reviewed by supervisory personnel. Judge Calder leaned forward as the first video began to play. The footage showed Kane approaching a young black man sitting on a park bench reading a book. The audio was crystal clear as Kane demanded identification and a justification for the young man's presence in what he called a high-crime area. "Officer, I'm just reading," the young man said politely, holding up a copy of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Kane's response was captured with perfect digital clarity. "Reading about how to hate cops, huh? You one of those Black Lives Matter troublemakers?" The man on the bench, later identified as university student Malik Jefferson, remained calm despite the obvious provocation. "Sir, I'm just reading a book about criminal justice reform. I haven't broken any law." "I'll decide what laws you've broken," Kane replied, reaching for his handcuffs. "Stand up and put your hands behind your back." "For what crime?" "Disorderly conduct, refusing to obey a lawful order." The video showed Kane forcing Jefferson into handcuffs while the young man continued asking what law he had violated. The arrest report that Judge Calder reviewed while the video played claimed Jefferson had been agitating against law enforcement and inciting anti-police sentiment among park visitors. The park was empty except for Jefferson and Kane. "This is a clear pattern," Judge Calder said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Kane targets black men for exercising their constitutional rights and then arrests them when they question his authority." Agent Torres advanced to the next video. "This one is even worse." The second recording showed Kane conducting what he claimed was a routine traffic stop of a vehicle driven by a young black woman with 2 children in the back seat. The woman, identified as Shen Roberts, had been stopped supposedly for following too closely behind another vehicle. Kane's approach was immediately aggressive. "License and registration. Keep your hands where I can see them." Roberts complied, handing over her documents while her children watched nervously from the back seat. "Officer, can you tell me why you stopped me?" "Following too closely. Reckless driving." "Sir, I was maintaining a safe distance. I'm a driving instructor. I teach following distance for a living." Kane's expression twisted with irritation. "Don't tell me how to do my job. Step out of the vehicle." "Why? This is just a traffic infraction." "Step out of the vehicle now or I'll arrest you for obstruction." The video showed Roberts reluctantly exiting while her children began to cry in the back. Kane handcuffed her immediately, claiming she had made furtive movements and appeared to be hiding something. The search of Roberts and her vehicle revealed nothing illegal. No drugs, no weapons, no contraband of any kind. The charges against her were later dropped, but not before she spent 6 hours in jail while her children were taken into temporary custody. "The worst part," Agent Torres said, "is that Kane's dashboard camera captured another angle of this same stop. It shows that Roberts never followed too closely. Kane stopped her for no legitimate reason. Judge Calder's judicial training had taught him to maintain emotional neutrality when reviewing evidence. But the systematic nature of Kane's misconduct was testing those limits. Each video revealed the same pattern: pretextual stops, escalated confrontations, and arrests designed to punish black citizens for exercising their rights. The third video was the most disturbing yet. It showed Kane's encounter with Terrell Jackson, the 19-year-old whose case had already appeared in earlier files. Jackson was walking home from work, still wearing his supermarket uniform, when Kane approached him claiming he matched the description of a robbery suspect. "I need to see some identification," Kane said, blocking Jackson's path on the sidewalk. "Officer, what did I do wrong?" Jackson asked, his voice carrying the nervousness of a teenager confronted by armed authority. "You match the description of a robbery suspect, black male, approximately 6 feet tall." "Sir, I'm coming from work. I have my name badge and everything." Kane's response was captured with devastating clarity. "I don't care where you're coming from. When I ask for identification, you give me identification. You don't ask questions." Jackson reached slowly for his wallet, his movements careful and deliberate. As he pulled out his ID, Kane suddenly grabbed his arm and spun him violently. "He's reaching for something!" Kane shouted, even though the video clearly showed Jackson complying with the order to produce identification. What followed was a brutal beating that left Jackson unconscious on the sidewalk. Kane's report claimed Jackson had attacked him with a weapon, but the body camera footage showed an unarmed teenager being systematically beaten while crying out for help. Judge Calder stopped the video. "How many witnesses were there to this assault?" "7, Agent Torres answered. All gave statements that contradicted Kane's report. Internal Affairs never interviewed any of them. Prosecutor Brooks opened another folder. Judge, we've also obtained the text message records from Kane's personal phone. The content is revealing. She handed Judge Calder a tablet displaying screenshots of conversations between Kane and other officers. The messages were filled with racial slurs, jokes about hunting black suspects, and explicit discussions about patrolling black neighborhoods to make pretextual stops. One conversation thread from 6 months earlier made Judge Calder's blood boil. Kane, caught 3 thugs tonight, all resisting arrest, of course. Unknown officer, good work, keep cleaning the streets. Kane, just doing my part to thin the herd. Another conversation showed Kane bragging about his arrest statistics. Kane, already hit my quota for the month. These people make it too easy. Unknown officer, how do you find so many criminals? Kane, easy. Just look for the right color in the wrong neighborhood. Who are the other officers in these conversations? Judge Calder asked. We're still identifying them, Agent Torres replied. But preliminary analysis suggests Kane was part of a group of officers coordinating their racist policing activities. The implications were chilling. Kane's misconduct was not isolated. It was part of a broader conspiracy within the department to systematically target black citizens with harassment, stops, and abuse. Judge Calder's phone rang. The caller ID showed Officer Lila Hamilton. Officer Hamilton, thank you for calling. I understand you have evidence relevant to our investigation. Hamilton's voice sounded nervous but determined. Judge Calder, I've been documenting Officer Kane's misconduct for more than a year. I have recordings, photographs, and written notes about incidents that were never reported or that were covered up by supervisors. Are you willing to testify about what you've witnessed? Yes, sir. I became a police officer to protect and serve the community. What Kane has been doing is the opposite of everything I swore to defend. Judge Calder arranged an immediate meeting between Hamilton and the federal investigators. Her evidence would provide the internal perspective to demonstrate that Kane's misconduct was known to other officers and supervisors who took no action. As the afternoon progressed, the evidence continued to accumulate against Kane and against the system that had protected him. Medical records from local hospitals showed a pattern of injuries consistent with excessive force in cases involving arrests made by Kane. Emergency room physicians had noted suspicious patterns but were never contacted by internal affairs investigators. Dr. Patricia Williams, chief of emergency medicine at Riverside General Hospital, had compiled her own unofficial documentation of Kane-related injuries. Her records showed 15 separate cases over 3 years in which patients arrived with wounds consistent with police brutality, all claiming to have been arrested by the same officer. I started collecting these records because the pattern was so obvious, Dr. Williams told the federal investigators. These weren't injuries from resisting arrest or falling during a struggle. They were deliberate beatings. Community leaders had also begun organizing in response to news of the federal investigation. Reverend Elias Thompson, pastor of the city's largest black church, convened a community meeting to discuss Kane's pattern of misconduct and identify other victims who might have been afraid to speak. This is not just about one officer, Reverend Thompson told more than 200 people gathered. This is about a system that allowed this officer to terrorize our community for 12 years while ignoring our complaints and dismissing our concerns. The community meeting produced new witnesses and victims who had never filed formal complaints because they believed the system would ignore them. Their testimonies added dozens of new incidents to the growing case against Kane. Civil rights attorney Maria Santos volunteered to coordinate legal support for Kane's victims. We're talking about a systematic violation of civil rights that affected hundreds of people over more than a decade. The federal government must understand that this is not just about individual cases. This is about a pattern of oppression that was institutionally protected. By nightfall, Judge Calder's investigation had expanded far beyond Jordan's arrest to encompass what appeared to be the most extensive police misconduct conspiracy in the district's history. The evidence was overwhelming. Video recordings, text messages, medical records, witness statements, and expert testimony that painted a picture of systematic racism sustained by institutional indifference. But perhaps the most powerful evidence came from the victims themselves. Young men like Malik Jefferson, Terrell Jackson, and Marcus Williams had found their voices and were demanding accountability for the abuses they had suffered. Judge Calder, Prosecutor Brooks said as they reviewed the day's findings. "We have enough evidence to charge Cain with dozens of federal crimes, civil rights violations, conspiracy, excessive force under color of law, false imprisonment. The charges could send him to prison for life." Judge Calder nodded, but his expression remained focused on the broader implications. "Selina, this is not just about punishing one bad officer. This is about transforming a system that allowed and protected his misconduct for more than a decade." The federal investigation had revealed not only Cain's crimes but the institutional failure that had made those crimes possible. Internal Affairs had ignored complaints. Supervisors had covered up incidents. And the department's culture had encouraged racist policing while protecting officers from any accountability. The next day's hearing would mark the beginning of the end of Dominic Cain's career in law enforcement. But more importantly, it would mark the start of a transformation that would ensure no other officer could terrorize a community while hiding behind a badge. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight. And justice was finally within reach of the hundreds of victims who had waited years for someone to take their complaints seriously. Federal Judge Caldwell Calder had done more than investigate his son's arrest. He had exposed a conspiracy of racism that would change policing in his community forever. In federal court at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, one of the most significant civil rights hearings in the district's history took place. Courtroom 4A, Judge Caldwell Calder's domain for more than 3 decades, was filled to capacity with journalists, civil rights activists, community members, and police officials who understood they were witnessing a moment that would forever transform the way policing was conducted in their community. Judge Calder entered the courtroom wearing the black robes that had become synonymous with constitutional justice and the defense of civil rights. His bearing was judicial and impartial, but everyone present understood the personal dimension of the case about to unfold. The man seated behind the bench was both a federal judge sworn to uphold the law and a father whose son had been victimized by the accused, now sitting nervously at the defense table. Dominic Cain appeared to have aged 10 years since the Tuesday night arrest. His police uniform had been replaced by a poorly fitting suit borrowed from his union representative. His hands trembled slightly as he avoided eye contact with the judge, the public, and the assembled press that would document his professional destruction for posterity. Beside him sat his court-appointed attorney, David Reynolds, a public defender specializing in criminal law, who had never handled a federal civil rights case of this magnitude. Reynolds had spent the previous 18 hours reviewing evidence that showed his client as a serial civil rights violator whose misconduct had been enabled by systematic institutional failures. At the prosecution table, Assistant United States Attorney Selina Brooks was surrounded by boxes of evidence, witness statements, and digital recordings that would form the foundation of the federal government's case against Cain. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Torres sat behind her, ready to present the technical evidence that would demonstrate the scope and scale of Cain's crimes. "All rise," the court clerk announced as Judge Calder took his position behind the bench. "The United States District Court for the Central District is now in session. The Honorable Caldwell Calder presiding." Judge Calder surveyed the courtroom with the calculated gaze of someone who had presided over thousands of hearings. But this one was different. This one was personal. This one would test every principle of judicial neutrality and constitutional justice that had guided his 30-year career. "You may be seated," Judge Calder said in a voice that had silenced countless attorneys and commanded respect in every courtroom of the federal system. "We are here today for the preliminary hearing in the case of United States v. Dominic Cain, case number 24-CV-1847. That case number would become historic. It was the first federal civil rights indictment arising from what initially appeared to be a routine arrest, but had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of systematic police misconduct. "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Calder continued, addressing Cain's attorney, "how does your client plead to the charges contained in the federal indictment?" Reynolds rose slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The plea was expected, but it sounded hollow in a courtroom where the overwhelming evidence of Cain's guilt had already been presented to the grand jury that issued the indictment. The charges were extensive: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, excessive force, false imprisonment, and obstruction of justice. "Ms. Brooks," Judge Calder said, turning to the prosecution table, Present your opening statement. Brooks rose with the confidence of someone who had never lost a civil rights case and who possessed evidence so compelling that conviction was virtually certain. She walked toward the jury box, even though this was a bench trial in which Judge Calder would serve as both judge and jury, a decision made to ensure that complex constitutional issues would be resolved by someone with federal civil rights expertise. Your Honor, Brooks began, over the next several hours, the United States will present evidence demonstrating the systematic violation of citizens' constitutional rights by Officer Dominic Kane based solely on their race. This is not a case about one bad arrest or a moment of poor judgment. This is a case about a 12-year pattern of racist policing facilitated, protected, and covered up by institutional indifference to civil rights violations. She pressed a remote control, and the courtroom screens displayed a timeline of Kane's arrests over 12 years. The image was devastating. Hundreds of arrests with an overwhelming majority targeting black men between the ages of 18 and 35. Your Honor will see that Officer Kane's arrest patterns show a clear racial bias. African Americans represent 12% of the city's population, but constitute 73% of the arrests made by Kane. This disparity cannot be explained by crime rates, geographic factors, or legitimate law enforcement considerations. Judge Calder studied the statistical evidence with the analytical mind that had made him one of the most respected federal judges in the country. The numbers were stark and undeniable, a pattern so clear it could only be explained by deliberate racial targeting. Furthermore, Brooks continued, the United States will present evidence that Officer Kane's misconduct was not unknown to his supervisors. Internal Affairs received 43 separate complaints about Kane's conduct over 12 years. 43, Your Honor. And in every case, those complaints were dismissed, buried, or ignored. The prosecution's presentation continued with methodical precision. Body camera recordings showed Kane's encounters with innocent citizens who had committed no crime beyond existing while black. Text message evidence revealed his racist attitudes and coordination with other officers. Medical records documented a pattern of excessive force that had sent citizens to emergency rooms. But perhaps the most powerful evidence came from the victims themselves. Terrell Jackson, the 19-year-old supermarket worker who had been beaten unconscious for the crime of walking home from work, testified from the stand with quiet dignity. His voice was steady as he recounted Kane's assault, but the emotional impact was devastating. He said, "I matched the description of a suspect," Jackson testified, "but the description was of a white man in his 40s with a beard. I'm black, I'm 19, and I'm clean-shaven. I was wearing my work uniform with my name badge clearly visible." "What happened when you tried to show Officer Kane your identification?" Brooks asked. "He grabbed my arm and spun me around. Then he started hitting me with his baton. I tried to protect my head, but he kept hitting me. I kept asking what I had done wrong, but he just kept hitting me." Jackson's testimony was corroborated by 7 witnesses and contradicted by Kane's false police report claiming Jackson had attacked him with a weapon. The body camera footage showed an unarmed teenager being systematically beaten while begging for mercy. Marcus Williams, the university student who had been arrested for reading a book about criminal justice reform, testified about Kane's pattern of targeting educated black men who demonstrated knowledge of their constitutional rights. "He said I was reading about how to hate the police," Williams testified. "But I was reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow for a criminal justice class. When I tried to explain that I was a student, he told me students like me were America's problem." Malik Jefferson, the young man who had been arrested for sitting on a park bench, described Kane's escalating aggression whenever black citizens questioned his authority or demonstrated knowledge of their rights. "He told me my constitutional rights didn't matter because I was in a high-crime area," Jefferson testified. "But I was sitting in a public park in broad daylight reading a book. The only crime in that park was what Officer Kane did to me." Each victim's testimony revealed the same pattern: pretextual stops, escalated confrontations without cause, and arrests designed to punish black citizens for asserting their dignity and their rights. The defense response was weak and unconvincing. Reynolds attempted to argue that Kane had followed department protocols and that his arrest patterns reflected the geographic distribution of crime in the city, but the evidence contradicted those claims at every point. "Your Honor," Reynolds said during his opening statement, Officer Kane was a dedicated law enforcement professional who served his community for 12 years. The charges against him are based on politically motivated interpretations of standard police procedures. Judge Calder's expression remained neutral, but anyone familiar with his judicial record knew that blaming civil rights violations on politics was the worst possible approach in his courtroom. The prosecution's presentation of evidence continued through the morning and into the afternoon. FBI analysts testified about the statistical impossibility of Kane's arrest patterns occurring without racial bias. Medical experts described injury patterns consistent with excessive force. Constitutional law experts explained how Kane's actions violated clearly established civil rights protections. But the most devastating testimony came from Officer Lila Hamilton, the police whistleblower who had secretly documented Kane's misconduct for more than a year. "I became a police officer to protect and serve the community," Hamilton testified. "What I saw Officer Kane doing was the opposite of everything I swore to defend. He was terrorizing innocent citizens and using his badge as a weapon against people who had done nothing wrong." Hamilton's internal testimony revealed the extent to which Kane's misconduct was known within the department, but ignored by supervisors more interested in protecting officers than in protecting civil rights. "I filed 3 separate reports about Officer Kane's conduct," Hamilton continued. "Each time I was told to mind my own business and focus on my own cases. When I insisted, I was threatened with disciplinary action for undermining department morale." The institutional cover-up was as damning as Kane's individual crimes. Internal Affairs Director Raymond Briggs was called as a witness and forced to explain why 43 civilian complaints had resulted in virtually no disciplinary action. "We thoroughly investigated each of those complaints," Briggs claimed under oath. "Mr. Briggs," Brooks responded, "did your thorough investigation of Terrell Jackson's complaint include interviewing the 7 witnesses who contradicted Officer Kane's report?" "We focused on the officer's version and the physical evidence." "Did you review the body camera footage that contradicted Officer Kane's report?" Briggs's silence was answer enough. The systematic failure of supervision had allowed Kane's misconduct to flourish for more than a decade. When the day's testimony concluded, Judge Calder announced that he would recess for 1 hour to review the evidence before issuing his decision. The courtroom emptied slowly as community members gathered outside to await the verdict that would determine whether 12 years of police misconduct would finally face consequences. Alone in his chambers, Judge Calder sat with the weight of the evidence showing Kane as one of the most prolific civil rights violators in the district's history. The case was personal. Kane had arrested his son without any legitimate reason. But the evidence was so overwhelming that any possible personal bias became irrelevant. Kane was guilty of systematic civil rights violations that had terrorized the black community for more than a decade. When court reconvened, Judge Calder's voice carried the authority of 30 years of judicial experience and the moral weight of constitutional justice. "In the case of United States versus Dominic Kane, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts contained in the federal indictment." The words reverberated through the packed courtroom like thunder. Kane collapsed into his chair as the reality of the federal convictions hit him. His career in law enforcement was over. His freedom was lost. His pattern of racist policing had finally met the force of federal justice. "Officer Kane," Judge Calder continued in a voice that maintained perfect judicial neutrality despite the personal dimension of the case, "you have violated the most fundamental principles of constitutional law enforcement. You have used your badge and your authority to systematically terrorize citizens based on their race. You have dishonored the police profession and betrayed the trust of the community you swore to serve." Judge Calder's sentencing would come later, but everyone in the courtroom understood that Kane faced decades in federal prison. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable, and the consequences would be severe. But even more importantly, the conviction sent a message that would resonate through police departments across the country. Civil rights violations would be prosecuted with the full weight of federal law regardless of the perpetrator's position or the victim's status. Justice had been served with mathematical precision, constitutional authority, and the righteous anger of a father whose son had been wronged. Dominic Kane's reign of terror was over, and the community he had victimized could finally begin to heal. 3 weeks after federal Judge Caldwell Calder's guilty verdict echoed through courtroom 4A, The expanding effects of Dominic Kane's conviction were transforming law enforcement and community relations throughout the district. The case that had begun with a university student standing in front of a library had become a landmark civil rights trial that would be studied in law schools for decades. Dominic Kane sat in his federal cell awaiting sentencing, facing 25 years in federal prison. The man who had terrorized black citizens for 12 years would spend the rest of his career behind bars rather than behind a badge. His police pension was revoked, his marriage ended, and his name became synonymous with everything wrong with policing in America. At the Riverside Police Department, Chief Harlan Graves announced the most comprehensive reforms in the department's history. The federal consent decree would place the entire police force under federal supervision for 5 years, ensuring that civil rights training and accountability measures became permanent elements of policing. "We cannot undo the harm caused by Officer Kane's actions," Chief Graves told the assembled officers and community leaders. "But we can ensure that systematic civil rights violations like these never happen again." Every officer would complete 40 hours of annual civil rights training. Body cameras became mandatory, with recordings automatically uploaded to federal servers. A civilian oversight board with subpoena power would investigate all misconduct complaints, replacing the failed internal affairs system. Captain Amara Chen, promoted to deputy chief, created a new community relations division staffed by officers committed to constitutional policing. Detective Garrett Holt, whose attempts to report Kane's misconduct had been suppressed, was named the division's first commander. Internal Affairs Director Raymond Briggs, whose cover-up of Kane's misconduct had been exposed during the trial, resigned and faced his own federal investigation. His replacement, appointed by the FBI, would implement protocols ensuring that civilian complaints were investigated by trained professionals rather than officers concerned with protecting colleagues. The city faced $15 million in civil rights settlements for Kane's victims. But Mayor Patricia Vargas saw this as an investment in rebuilding community trust. "These payments represent our commitment to ensuring these failures never happen again," she announced. The federal investigation expanded beyond Kane to other officers whose text messages revealed their participation in the racist conspiracy. Officers Harlan Briggs and Kevin Mills faced federal charges for conspiracy to violate civil rights, while 3 supervisors were terminated for failing to investigate complaints about Kane's conduct. Reverend Elias Thompson's church became an organizing center, hosting weekly meetings where residents could report misconduct and learn their constitutional rights. Dr. Patricia Williams established a medical monitoring program to track injuries related to police interventions and prevent future systematic abuse. Civil rights attorney Maria Santos opened a specialized police misconduct office funded by federal grants. Her firm received more than 200 inquiries from citizens who had previously been afraid to come forward. Kane's conviction empowered victims to speak, Santos explained. Officer Lila Hamilton, the whistleblower whose secret documentation proved crucial to Kane's conviction, was promoted to sergeant and assigned to lead the new integrity unit. "Officer Kane forgot his oath and betrayed everything we represent," she told new recruits during civil rights training. In federal court, Judge Caldwell Calder returned to his usual caseload, but the Kane case had reinforced his commitment to ensuring meaningful constitutional protections. His subsequent judicial opinions would cite the Kane conviction as precedent for more aggressive federal prosecutions in civil rights cases. For Judge Calder, the most important outcome was personal. The experience had strengthened his relationship with Jordan, who had demonstrated extraordinary courage throughout the ordeal. Jordan Calder returned to his constitutional law studies with renewed passion. His academic understanding was now informed by the lived experience of injustice and legal remedy. "I used to think constitutional law was about abstract principles," Jordan told his father. "Now I understand it's about real people and real protections." Jordan had become a symbol of both police misconduct and the possibility of justice, speaking at community meetings and mentoring other young people who had lived through similar encounters. His pre-law studies took a new direction. He would follow his father's path toward the federal bench, but first he would work as a civil rights attorney. "Justice," Jordan explained to high school students, "requires people willing to fight for it even when the system tries to silence them." 3 months after the conviction, Terrell Jackson received a federal settlement that paid for his college education. He chose to study criminal justice, inspired by the prosecutors who had taken his case seriously. "I want to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else," Jackson told reporters. Marcus Williams transferred to law school, his arrest for reading about criminal justice reform becoming the impetus that would lead him to reform the system from within. Malik Jefferson became a community organizer working with Reverend Thompson to educate residents about their constitutional rights. The impact of Cain's conviction was felt in the policing community nationwide. Police departments reviewed their complaint procedures and training protocols. The International Association of Chiefs of Police issued new guidelines, while the Department of Justice announced increased funding for constitutional training. More profoundly, the relationship between the Riverside community and the police was transforming. Fear and distrust were gradually replaced by dialogue and accountability through monthly forums that brought officers and residents together. "Change is slow," Deputy Chief Chen acknowledged, "but Cain's conviction demonstrated that no one is above the law. We are rebuilding trust through actions, not words." When autumn returned to the campus, Jordan sat on the library steps studying for his LSAT, preparing for the law school applications that would launch his civil rights career. Professor Grant joined him, carrying the constitutional law casebook that would soon include the Cain conviction as a historic precedent. "How does it feel to be part of legal history?" Grant asked. Jordan smiled, thinking of his journey from victim to advocate. "It feels like responsibility. My arrest was personal, but the changes belong to everyone." Dominic Cain's 25-year sentence brought legal closure, but the true victory was the systematic change that would prevent future officers from following his path. The community that had once lived in fear now had civilian oversight, federal monitoring, and a legal precedent establishing that civil rights violations would be aggressively prosecuted. Officer Cain had tried to teach Jordan a lesson about power and submission. Instead, he learned that some fathers are more dangerous when their children are threatened, and that federal justice reaches any officer who violates constitutional rights. The badge Cain believed made him untouchable became the instrument of his destruction. The system he thought would protect him was the one that delivered the justice he had denied to others. Constitutional law ceased to be an abstract theory. It became real protection for real people, enforced by judges who understood that civil rights mean nothing unless they can be made to matter. The consequences would continue for years as reforms took root and trust was rebuilt. But the foundation already existed for a community where constitutional rights mattered more than racial prejudice, where police served all citizens equally, and where young people like Jordan could pursue their dreams without fear. Justice had been served. But more importantly, it would remain protected for the generations to come who would inherit a system strengthened by those who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. If this story moved you even for a moment, consider subscribing. We are building a space for voices that were once ignored, and every new subscriber helps us keep these stories alive. One single click means the difference.